Hello everybody and welcome to Nathan Unshuffled and to my latest episode here of the Unshuffled series where I order albums into a ranking list. This time I'm talking about the band Genesis, one of the premier progressive rock bands. I did a video on Yes and ranked their albums. I ranked Jethro Tull's albums. I also ranked Gentle Giant albums, and it felt like this was the next logical step to my journey of ranking different bands' discographies because they're one of my favorite bands. They're one of the premier progressive rock acts that got me into the genre. My dad's favorite three bands are Yes, Genesis, and Gentle Giant, so it was one of the first bands he shared with me and that I fell in love with, so they're a very meaningful band. And I'm coming at this list from a prog person's perspective because I don't know who's going to be watching this, and I know there's probably people out there who have a lot of affinity to their more pop-oriented part of their career, but I just want to be upfront about my biases and where I come into with this list. I'm much more the prog fan, so you'll definitely see a bias towards their prog records on my list. But I wanted to give all their albums a fair shake and give my impressions and opinions. And this is just my preference list. You know, this isn't a definitive ranking list, so just how I feel about these records personally and giving a little bit of background into my history and thoughts and impressions of these. So I went and picked up all of these records on vinyl. I had several of them already, but I finished out the collection so that I could have them all and listen to them on vinyl in preparation for the episode. It was a fun experience and I want to share it, and hopefully you'll enjoy my ranking list. So let's start. There's 15 studio albums. I'm only doing studio albums. I know they have some acclaimed live albums as well and various compilations and other things, but I'm sticking with the studio albums, and so there's 15 of them, and let's start at number 15. Number 15 is From Genesis to Revelation from 1969. So this is their first album. To me, this is their least Genesis-sounding album. It feels like a very psychedelic late 60s pop record, you know. Feels much more like, you know, maybe what the Beatles or early Pink Floyd were doing or something like that, but it doesn't really have that classic Genesis sound yet. It's fascinating to hear Peter Gabriel on vocals here, but aside from that, it's very much separated in my mind from what Genesis would be doing later, and so it's hard to put this in the same list amongst all of these other albums. But there are some highlights throughout the track. It's definitely an enjoyable listen. It's not all just totally forgettable. You got Where the Sour Turns to Sweet with some lush horns and strings to open the piece. You got this classic 60s Doors-esque psych sound of The Serpent, a classic Beach Boys, Beatles type sound of In Hiding, and a sweet ballad in Windows. So you got little highlights throughout the record, but overall it just doesn't create a satisfying package to me. It feels a little bit overlong, even though it's probably one of their shorter records. You know, it's right hovering in that low 40s minute range. But for some reason, it just takes a while to get through. There's a lot of different songs that just don't connect with me and kind of blend into the background. There are some interesting instrumental interludes that lead between tracks a little bit in certain cases, but just overall, it's a little bit bland for me. It just doesn't stand out in much of a way, and I don't think it really is much better than any generic pop record of the day and age of this time, so it just doesn't really grab my attention, so that has to be at the bottom of my list. Okay, so moving on, at number 14, I've got Calling All Stations from 1997, going to the other end of their spectrum here, the last album, the one that has Ray Wilson on vocals instead of Phil Collins. It's basically Phil Collins left the group with We Can't Dance, and Mike Rutherford and Tony Banks brought in Ray Wilson to take over the vocal duties. And so once again, similar to From Genesis to Revelation, it just doesn't feel as much the same band because it's missing that component of Phil Collins, who's such a big portion of the band and their sound, especially through the 80s. So it feels a little bit off to me, but it isn't bad at all. It's still very accessible and listenable. It has this light rock AOR type feel to it, maybe more of an 80s style pop rock sound, which is interesting because it came out in 97, so perhaps it feels a little bit dated to me in its sound design, but it has some interesting tracks throughout. You know, it has The Dividing Line is a highlight standout track with a little bit of some prog flourishes and touches in there. There's some really cool poppier songs. I like Congo as a bit of a more pop hit for them. Calling All Stations is a solid rock opener with Ray Wilson really showcasing his vocal abilities. Alien Afternoon gives a little bit of a quirky, proggy pop feel to it in its long runtime with some interesting synths and drum fills and guitar lines and atmospheric vocals. So you got some interesting things throughout here. So of course it's not just a total throwaway album by any stretch. There's some fun things to catch and to entertain, which seems to be the case for me when it comes to these later Genesis records. There's little hidden gems, there's little flashes of brilliance and fun things, but there's so many forgettable tracks that just don't stick with me, that aren't memorable, that just don't stand out to me in their discography, and that's why I rank this album a little bit lower. You know, you get some good progginess, you get some little hidden gem tracks, but overall it's just a little bit forgettable for me as I listen through their albums. Number 13, I have We Can't Dance from 1991. Once again, overall a decent pop record. It has some cool stuff to it, but it's a little bit overlong, similar to Calling All Stations. It's 70 minutes, and there's just certain tracks that just pass me by without really grabbing my attention. Some of the better tracks are really good, though. There's some solid pop tunes here, such as No Son of Mine and Jesus He Knows Me, I Can't Dance, Tell Me Why. These are songs coming in that I was familiar with just because I've heard them on radio or out in the ether. Some songs are a little bit expanded and hinting to their proggier roots, even if not fully going there, like Driving the Last Spike, the track Living Forever, which has a pretty interesting instrumental section towards the end of it. The second half of Fading Lights brings a bit of that prog instrumental flair as well, but a lot of these songs in between just are pleasant and fine to listen to. They don't distract, they don't sound horrible in any fashion, but they're just unmemorable. I just don't think about them, and so once again, there's a little bit of a bland quality to some of these tracks, and maybe this album could have benefited from trimming a few of those tracks out of the mix. But definitely some fun things to behold here, definitely some interesting tracks to pull out and to listen to. So it's not a total waste. I think it's a good album, and it could have provided for a good finale for them if this was the final album. Good send-off for Phil Collins. So definitely a good album with some great tracks on it, but just doesn't connect with me personally because there's several tracks that just don't grab me very much at all. So moving into number 12, this one I see a lot of negative opinions on from my fellow prog people who I associate with. This is Abacab from 1981. And to me, this was like their official declaration that they're into this pop world and abandoning the prog of it all. You know, Duke sort of blended the two sides a little bit better, had a bit of that pop influence, but kept some of that progginess, which we'll get to a little down the list. But this one just really fully embraces the pop mentality that they were going for. And for a lot of people, I think that was a big turnoff for those who loved the band up to that point and were more a fan of their proggier roots. But there's some good stuff on here regardless, in my opinion. I like the title track that opens Abacab. It's interesting to me throughout this 80s period how it's very pop-centered, but sometimes these tracks are really lengthened and have room to stretch and grow. It's like they're the length of what you'd expect out of a prog track, but it just gives them more space and room to play out these pop melodies. So it's interesting how they're blending these mentalities between prog and pop to me. And Abacab, I think, is a good example of that. A really interesting, longer length prog pop song with cool synth work and pounding drums. Perhaps it gets a bit repetitive by the end, which a lot of these longer pop songs seem to do for me. Maybe it doesn't even need to be that long, even though it's interesting that they're keeping that progressive structure in some ways. But still some interesting stuff on the track. And I like No Reply at All, more of a poppier track with a very 80s pop vibe. Me and Sarah Jane is a great way of blending some of the prog and the pop together. It has a minimal start with keyboard textures and vague reggae drum beats before it gets a bit more upbeat. But there's some interesting keyboard bits from Tony Banks here, pretty consistent drum pattern. Really one of the more proggier tracks of the record, so that's pretty interesting to me. Dodo Lurker also has a bit of their progginess baked into into it as well. So, but then beyond those tracks, you get a little bit of the filler tracks, and you get what I think is probably the worst track in the whole Genesis discography, which is Whodunit, which is just silly, repetitive, and uninteresting. Just is grating to listen to be honest. It's a really hard track to get through. It's only like 3 minutes long, but it feels so long because it's just the same thing over and over, and it just is relentless and not a great track at all. But beyond that, Man on the Corner is not bad pop music. I like that. There's some interesting little things, little flashes, like I said, of interesting things they're doing, trying to still integrate a little bit of that progginess, but really embracing their pop mentality. Makes for a mixed bag of a record, in my opinion, which is why it ranks a bit lower on my list. Some good stuff here and there, but some tracks like Keep It Dark and Like It or Not that just don't really do anything for me and just don't stick in my brain very well. So that's why I put Abacab up here at number 12. Invisible Touch is next at number 11 from 1986. I enjoyed this album more than I expected, because to me this is probably the most out-and-out pop record from the 80s. This is just totally them embracing this pop mentality with all these pop singles, but they're really good singles. They're good pop tracks that I enjoy listening to. I think the title track is a fun, upbeat pop track. Tonight, 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 again, like I was mentioning before, is one of those more extended pop tracks. It's like almost 9 minutes long, but it's very poppy in its vocals and approach, but you get a lot of atmosphere, and it really lays down and gives a lot of space to the music with these almost African style programmed drums and these great vocals from Phil and synth pads and guitar stabs. It's a really interesting slow build of a track that I actually enjoy quite a bit. Land of Confusion and Into Deep are also interesting pop hits that I really like. Great catchy songs that really stick out to me in the track list. I like Domino is probably one of the more proggier pieces of the record. You know, a little over 10 minutes, probably one of the more interesting tracks also. I think Throwing It All Away is a pleasant ballad, really good. And The Brazilian gives you a bit of that prog instrumental flair with some Latin-favored percussion and 80s style synths. Maybe one of my least favorite of their instrumental tracks compared to what came before, but it's still interesting and it's still cool to hear it in tandem with all these very standard 80s pop hits. So it's an interesting blend of things, you know? That's why I think it's a step above Abacab, because it's still really leaning into that pop direction and really sacrificing most of what was known in their prog days. But it's still much more listenable. It doesn't have a track that really is distracting and terrible like Abacab does. And it's just a fun listen through. It is really cool. So I think it's a great album, maybe a bit underrated by prog fans, really fun to listen to, and just a really solid collection of hits from them. So Invisible Touch gets the 11 spot. So now we get into the top 10, and these are albums that I connect with a bit more, so I'll probably have a bit more to say, but let's see. 10, I'm going with their self-titled record, Genesis, from 1983. So I believe, aside from Duke, which to me is more of that transitional album, this is the best of their pure pop albums. I think this is where they got the blend just right between still giving some credence to their previous prog leanings, but embracing the pop as well into a format that makes sense, and everything works really well together. In fact, the first half of the album, side A, if you will, is one of the strongest sides of Genesis material, I think. It's a really great showcase for all that they're about in their 80s period. Mama is just a really outstanding opening track, a very 80s drum sound and a slow build. Phil's vocals are interesting and get more intense as the piece goes forward, and it starts to open more in its soundscape as it goes to this more 80s pop piece with some darker, menacing atmosphere. It's just a really cool extended track, and That's All is one of their more fun pop hits with a cool R&B flavored piano lick. I really enjoy that track as well. Sounds very much in line with Phil Collins material at this time. And then you get this 1-2 punch of Home by the Sea and Second Home by the Sea, where you get a cool rock vibe, maybe more of the pop-centric style in the first half, half, but then you get an extended instrumental that really brings in their prog roots with the second half of the track, with some really cool blend of 80s electronic sounding elements with some more adventurous proggy sounds. So I think that's a real highlight and makes for a really excellent side of music. The second side doesn't grab me quite as well. Illegal Alien, I think, is fine and kind of a fun little pop ditty, but I know it's a little bit controversial and probably down on the list of people's favorites because of the subject matter and because of the style of it, which I can totally understand. And then we get into more standard pop fare from them. Nothing too egregiously terrible, nothing that distracts or takes away. Just pleasant, interesting tracks that close out the record and give more credence to their pop side of the equation, but doing it pretty well. So I think this is a serviceable record that really stands out in their 80s period of music, that they can do really intelligent pop music and keep a little bit of their prog roots into the mix and create something that's a really good combination of those things. And that's what I think their self-titled record does really expertly well. Then we move into number 9 on my list, and this is And Then There Were Three from 1978. And on paper, this should be probably higher on my list because it has that classic sound. There was this mid-period that they had a sound that I really loved, from Trick of the Tail to Wind and Wuthering to this album. There's this like really romantic style prog. I think it's really influential to the neo-prog and newer prog stuff that came out in the 80s and later. So I really like this sound, but to me this is clearly the weaker third of those trilogy of albums, because partially it's missing Steve Hackett. He left the group after Wind and Wuthering, so there's a big hole that isn't really filled very well. The tracks aren't nearly as memorable to me, even though that has their characteristic bombastic symphonic sound here with some lush, majestic, sweeping stuff going on. There's some good hidden gems here. Definitely not a sellout album, you know. It's definitely not them going pure into their pop direction yet. There's still plenty of prog to enjoy here, but you get a little piece of it with something like Follow You, Follow Me, which is at the tail end of the album. But throughout, there's just so many great prog moments. Down and Out is a really exciting opening with the typical symphonic style. Bombastic and proggy, maybe a little bit messy to me in the way it comes across, but it's still great, and some great keyboard magic from Tony Banks and some great drumming. So it's a really fun track. I really like Burning Rope. It's one of their great like mini epics during this period. All the hallmarks of this era, some great proggy goodness and moments of intensity. Some similarities to maybe something like One for the Vine from Wind and Wuthering, but really cool and really great proggy bombastic section about 5 minutes into the mix. So there's some really cool stuff. I really like Scenes from a Night's Dream. I think that's a fun, upbeat proggy song. The Lady Lies is a cool track with interesting synths and a prominent bass line, great shuffling drums and interesting textures in the keys with a really explosive ending. So you've got a lot of cool things baked into the list. I love Snowbound that comes earlier, a great slow burning track with tons of passion and energy. I really like all of these tracks really well, and I think this is one of the great later era Genesis albums before they really went into their pop direction. I think it still has the characteristics that you come to know and love from them, just not as memorable as some of the stuff that came before in the prog period, and it is missing a bit of that Steve Hackett special sauce that I think made them so spectacular in those other 70s albums that we'll be getting to. So, but not bad, and I think it's probably forgotten and underrated by a lot of people just because it doesn't have that standout track that a lot of these other albums do. But really, really great album that I think is well deserved in their catalog and on this list. Moving to number 8, I have Trespass from 1970, and this is miles better than their debut album for me. This is where they really showcase their progginess, and it was a great signpost to what you can expect with their proggier albums to come. So it's a really interesting look into their early days and where their mindset was at before they really became a fully fledged prog band with Nursery Cryme. And I think this was them putting their foot forward and dipping their toes in those waters. And we get some really iconic pieces of music here. I love the opening, Looking for Someone. You get a classic start with Peter Gabriel's vocals and some smoky organ. The band comes in for some more rock and prog sounds and a quirky storytelling vibe, you know, not unlike Musical Box that would come later, but maybe a more raw version of it. A little bit primitive, but a really solid start to the album. I really like the folkiness and great piano of Visions of Angels. Sounds like a song from their debut, but a bit more progified and beefed up to be a bit more special. Stagnation has always been a favorite, where you get those classic Genesis 12-string guitars that chime and add flavor to the keys. This is a really beautiful track with some dark, moody organ soloing, leading to some more upbeat progginess with some flute. And Gabriel's perfect vocals with keyboard atmosphere. This really signifies that style of Genesis that they would come to be known by, which is really a great look into their future. And then you've got The Knife, which is one of their first real standout songs that they would play often live. It has a great driving rhythm, accented by wonderful organ, snarling fuzz bass, and frantic guitar with Gabriel's manic vocals. It's a fun proggy track with great energy that just builds and builds and leads to this very satisfying big, massive conclusion, and it's just a real highlight in their catalog that cannot be denied. So it's cool to see how they dip their toes into the water here, that there's some real majestic moments already at play. I was blown away when I heard this first, because this wasn't an album my dad showed me. He started with Nursery Cryme, because to him that's where the classic Genesis period starts, and Trespass is not an album he was very familiar with. So when I discovered it later on my own, after he showed me all the albums he was familiar with, it was like a breath of fresh air. Like, wow, there's this really cool symphonic prog Genesis record that I hadn't heard yet that is nearly almost as good as the classics of their era. So that's why it holds a special place in my heart. I love the sounds of it, that it really showcases where they're going. Maybe in a bit less refined version, but part of that rawness is really energetic and interesting. That only adds to the character of the record, which gives it more points in its favor. So a fun record. Every track has something interesting in it, and it really showcased where the band was at and where they'd be headed and how they'd be able to refine this sound into something truly special. So at number 7, we have Duke from 1980. This is the highest placing of the technically 80s records, I suppose, but I don't really view it in the same lane as those others, because this still has the touchstones of their proggy flavor. To me, this is the best blend of the prog and pop side of the equation of Genesis, because you have this sprawling suite that basically opens the album with Behind the Lines, Duchess, guide vocal. It's just a really beautiful suite, and then it ends with the later part of the album, where we get some instrumental tracks that end the album in such a fascinating, bombastic, proggy way. So you get these great prog moments throughout the record that really pay homage and honor their prog history, but they're also doing a lot of poppy, fun things, but they're all well crafted and great pop music. You know, Behind the Lines starts with this big bombastic prog opening, but then we get into this more poppier Phil Collins vocal section, which just gives the right blend of pop, funk, and prog into a really interesting stew. Just in that track alone, you get this perfect encapsulation of their different morphine sounds at the time in their career. I like even the poppiness of something like Man of Our Times, which blends some of that pop flavor and that big ballad feel with some prog pomposity that they were known for in their Trick of the Tail, Wind and Wuthering era. Heath A's is a beautiful ballad, a great fit for Phil Collins and Tony Banks' keyboard wizardry. Just a great symphonic proggy touch, but enough catchy pop hooks to make it work. Even the more poppier tracks like Misunderstanding and Turn It On Again are just a blast to listen to. I think Turn It On Again especially is one of their best pop tracks. It's just so rocking and so fun, and it's infectious and a great track. Cul-de-sac is one of my favorite tracks of the record that really brings to mind that Wind and Wuthering, Trick of the Tail references. It's great keyboards from Tony Banks, very memorable vocal hooks, and it just is a great package of music. And like I mentioned, the finale, the final 2 tracks, Duke's Travels and Duke's End, are just a fantastic epic proggy closing, similar to something like Los Indos from Trick of the Tail, that just really wraps up the album in a fascinating way, makes it feel like a great conceptual album that has a flow to it, that has a beginning and ending that work together to make it a full piece of music. Big fan of Duke. It's one of those hidden gems also for me that isn't part of the classical prog phase that I like so much, but it has so much going for it that it's a fun listen, and I like the blending. I like pop music. I'm not opposed to it. Of course, I definitely prefer progressive rock because to me it's more adventurous and interesting, and they're able to play a bit more and do different things that grab your ear and are able to explore different territory. But there's nothing wrong with a great catchy pop hook that really grabs your ears and that is something you want to keep listening to. It's an earworm that you can't get out of your brain. I love that aspect too. So blend those two worlds together and you have something really special. And I think Duke really has that. And so it's definitely one of my favorite records from Genesis. But now we get into the top 6, and these to me are all like 5-star perfect albums. To me, the highlight of prog, you know, if you were to look at a period of prog music, look at a band's catalog to really give you an impression of what was great about prog in this era, I would say go to this Nursery Cryme to Wind and Wuthering run of albums. It's just a perfect run that showcased all that I love about music. And to start it off at number 6, I have Wind and Wuthering from 1976, which I personally love, and I considered putting it even higher on the list, but it felt hard to move out any of these other classic prog records that are coming up. But it's just such a great, beautiful record. It has this almost dreamy, whimsical style air to it that I really love. I don't think it gets as recognized as Trick of the Tail, but it's right in line with it to me. It has a similar style and feel, but maybe it's a bit more romantic and lush and gives them more room to stretch their legs a little bit. I really love it. I think 11th Earl of Mar is one of their best opening tracks, comes out with a burst of prog energy, bringing that Dance on a Volcano energy, but doing its own thing with maybe a bit more of a pastoral and lush sound to it. Love the dreamy atmospheric middle section, giving some lighter contrast with those 12-string guitars and lush harmony vocals before the power comes back in. Bit of an old school style feel to this, like Nursery Cryme era, baked in as well with the whimsical style to it, but it also encapsulates their current era during this time in the later 70s. So it's a great combination of sounds and styles. One for the Vine is just a gorgeous masterpiece of a track. Tony Banks really shines on piano and keyboards. Phil gives an emotional powerhouse of a vocal. It has this dreamlike quality as it morphs and moves through so many different sections. There's some great upbeat, proggier parts that hit all my prog buttons, I'd say, and some glorious electric guitar lines as well, accented in the second half. It's just one of my favorite all-time prog tracks that I just completely love. A little bit of a dip when you get to Your Own Special Way, which I really enjoy. I don't think it's bad, but definitely not the powerhouse song that the previous two were, more leaning into their pop direction, but has a really beautiful style sound to it as well. And then you end this side of the record with a proggy instrumental of What Gorilla, with a jazzy feel to it and lots of Tony Banks playing. And then the second half is also just as good, with All in a Mouse's Night being a playful, fun, whimsical track that really showcases their prog leanings. Blood on the Rooftops is a beautiful showcase for Steve Hackett with some acoustic classical guitar and a sublime lead vocal. Really one of the most gorgeous pieces of music the band composed in this era. And you get some more instrumental fireworks before you close it all out with this excellent ending in Afterglow, which is just one of their premier moments and showcases all that's powerful about Phil Collins' vocals in this majestic build, and it's just a beautiful ending to the record. So there's so much to love on Wind and Wuthering. I think it's underrated by some people. Probably should raise a few spots for me if I'm being more honest about my tastes. And once again, it was a record I discovered a little bit later. My dad, he took me from Nursery Cryme to Trick of the Tail and sort of let me go from there. And so this was a pleasant surprise that this was just as good as Trick of the Tail to me. And I really love it and think it's a fantastic record. Definitely a highlight in their career and a great send-off for Steve Hackett. At number 5, I've got Nursery Cryme from 1971, and this is the first real classic record in their discography. This is where it all came together, and they were able to showcase all that's great in prog music through this album. You know, it started with Trespass. They started to show their prog leanings, and were able to give you that style that they're going to be known for, but they really refined it here in a fantastic way that showcases all that's wonderful and beautiful about the band. You know, Gabriel's at his most quirky and character-driven throughout these tracks. You got that British humor and really quirky lyrics going on throughout the track. You got this eclecticism and beauty and wonder all baked in. A wildly creative record full of whimsy and fun. The musical box is just a classic. It opens the record. It's one of their signature tracks for a reason. It takes you on a journey through meditative pastoral sounds to more energetic outbursts and shows Peter Gabriel's penchant for storytelling, and ends with this epic explosion at the end. Just a beautiful, wonderful track leading into For Absent Friends, which is more of a lighter piece with Phil Collins getting a chance to shine on vocals with more of those 12-string pastoral type guitars and sublime melodies. But then we get more of that quirky, more rock flavor with Return of the Giant Hogweed, with some great shuffling drums and a heavier edge and some fantastic flute work baked in. Seven Stones is a sweet symphonic treat with some lighter pastoral moments and great flute work, and has some more epic moments baked in. I think this is a underrated track that was even better than I remembered it upon re-listening to all these records. Harold the Barrel is just a fun little bouncy romp of a track before we lead into Harlequin, which really gives focus to those sparkling 12-string guitars and vocal harmonies. And then Fountain of Salmacis is just a fantastic masterpiece of a conclusion with these big mellotron washes and deep bass pedals. Just gives this really majestic, wonderful air to it. An incredible, adventurous middle proggy instrumental section, which spotlights some organs, some electric guitar soloing, and light flute work. This is one of the premier prog tracks in their discography, so no dud among those. Those are all classic tracks. They all work really well, and it's a great package of music that blends their styles of this quirky, proggy, energetic type feel, but some of these more pastoral, sweet-sounding moments, and it just comes to total fruition here with one of their most classic records. So had to put this high on the list. At number 5, for many people, I'm sure it could rank even higher than this, but it's a fantastic start to what would be one of the greatest progressive periods of music for any band. This discography is just really incredible and should certainly be highlighted. Number 4, I have A Trick of the Tail from 1976. This is a great prog statement that the band came out with after the departure of Peter Gabriel. Of course, Peter Gabriel left after The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, and there was a bit of a question mark of how would the band proceed without him, because he was such an eccentric, important, integral frontman for the group. Like, what would they do next? And Phil Collins takes the lead and creates an incredible, beautiful album that just sounds lush and fantastic, has so many beautiful, astounding moments, a bit warmer and more inviting perhaps than some of the more stark moments from the previous album. So it has a warmth and invitingness to it, but it doesn't lose its prog sensibilities and sense of adventurous storytelling throughout either. So maybe you lose a bit of that character that Gabriel brought into the music, but it's made up for with this really lush, majestic sound that they're able to develop here. Dance on a Volcano is a fantastic opener, full of energy, a prog masterwork with great powerful drums and epic keyboards, a frantic prog energy, and a big anthemic chorus. A real statement by the band that, no, we're still embracing our prog flavor, even with the departure of Peter Gabriel. And I think it's just a wonderful thing to behold. Entangled is a beautiful track with these 12-string guitars and beautiful vocals from Phil Collins, beautiful chorus with these layered vocal harmonies, and the ending adds some haunting mellotron to the mix. Squonk is a groovy rocker, a really cool feel, upbeat progginess. What's not to like in a track like that, right? It's just a really fun, breezy track to get through. Madman Moon is just a beautiful treat with some wonderful piano from Tony Banks and some beautiful vocals. You add some keyboards and some bass pedals, and you get this beautifully melodic piece that's just gorgeous and stunning, really. Robbery, Assault, and Battery is one of those more fast-paced proggy numbers, maybe similar to some of those early, like, Nursery Cryme, like Harold the Barrel type thing. A lot of whimsy and fun and some amazing keyboard work baked in and some driving drumming. Ripples is another gorgeous track that has some amazing acoustic guitar work, classical feel and Banks piano lines, just an amazing track. Trick of the Tail is a wonderful poppy track that sounds like it's taking its cue from maybe a later era Beatles record. And then Los Indos ends it in a glorious fashion with this proggy outburst of this incredible instrumental prog bombast, which brings everything together, brings all these themes into one excellent piece of music, and it's just one of the greatest prog finales of any record. So it hits hard, it's all wonderful, it's a beautiful record. It does a great balance between these more beautiful melodic moments, but also these heavier proggy bits that really bring in the energy and excitement. You get some whimsical moments, you get some good storytelling. It's just all there, everything you'd come to know and love from Genesis. And it raises a bit, in my opinion, just thinking of the fact that the band had to move on from Peter Gabriel's loss and were able to come out the gate with such a strong record really signifies that this is a special band, and they were able to pick up the pieces and put together something that was fantastic and showed their fans that, you know, we're still here and we're still kicking and playing prog music just like you've loved from us in the past. All right, now we get to the top three, and to me this is like the trio of prog perfection, right? This is the trio of albums that they're often most known for, I think, in the prog sphere. So fitting to me that these would be the final three on the list. And at number 3, I've got Foxtrot from 1972. This is a classic album in the genre definitely for a reason. Showcases the best sides of Genesis from this era, and every track sings in its own particular way. Watcher of the Skies has an iconic opening with that mellotron. Really takes its time to build as the drums and bass line come in. A real classic track showing why Genesis are the masters at symphonic prog. There's some fast-paced sections, there's some big epic mellotron, and it's just a beautiful track that whenever I hear it, it's just immediate that I know this is Genesis, and it just brings all these great feelings to me. Timetable has some beautiful classical sound and piano before Gabriel's distinct vocals come in with a beautiful melody. Mostly a ballad, but it still has some variety to it, and it has this melancholy type mood about the passage of time. Get 'Em Out by Friday is a more energetic track that showcases these great grand keyboards and drums and bass before we get into a quirky pattern, and the track proceeds with this excitement and vigor. There's some slower moments accented by beautiful guitar lines and Gabriel's eccentric vocals. But I like the groove to this piece. It really tells a story and really showcases Gabriel's ability to play these different characters and form this almost mini opera style to this track. Can Utility and the Coastliners is one of the most underrated gems of their catalog. Beautiful 12-string guitar opening, Gabriel's clear vocals, this great beautiful pastoral feel to it. And it just adds more power as it goes along with some bass and drumming work and great keyboard backing to give it this epic feel. Proof that you can write a great prog epic track even in under 6 minutes length. We get Horizons, which is a beautiful instrumental guitar, acoustic guitar passage that leads us right into the big epic of Supper's Ready, which is totally iconic, goes through so many different modes and movements, has those iconic 12-string guitars at the start with Gabriel's iconic vocals. It's just beautiful, and it moves and morphs from there. It's one of the seminal epic prog tracks. You know, if you were to talk about what are the biggest prog epics of all time, this would certainly be 1 or 2 on the list probably, because it really showcases the band's ability to tell stories and to go through so many different sections, but have them all work together in tandem to create one piece that feels complete and whole. And there's so many quirky bits to it. There's the whole Apocalypse and 7/8 section. There's the Willow Farm type bouncy prog section. There's just so many different things going on in the makes. There's heavier parts. There's parts that are more signifying like battle cries. And it's just a wonderful expression of music that goes through so many different things, showcases all the band's abilities, and gives this the most epic conclusion that you could possibly imagine with this big take them to the New Jerusalem moment. Great way to end an epic, and showcases all that's great about the band, and truly is an iconic piece of work in the progressive rock world. So definitely love this album. I think it's a total classic. It's undeniable just listening through. Every track is great in its own right, and it just showcases all the best about prog in one 40-minute style package, or 50-minute style, I should say. A great album, great stuff, and one of my favorites of the genre, so definitely deserve to be in the top 3 here. Some people would probably place it at number 1. But at number 2, I've got The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway from 1974. And maybe for some people this is a bit high on the list. Some people, I think, struggle with this one a bit because it is really long and sprawling, and maybe not every section of it works for you. The story is really quirky and strange, and I know that throws some people off and is a little bit strange, but I just really was blown away by this album upon first listen, because I love concept records. I love the storytelling aspect to it. I like the quirkiness of the story, even sometimes it's pretty nonsensical, especially if you read the liner notes and try to read along with the story. It's just really wacky how it's written, and that's part of the charm of it to me. Part of the charm of this album is that not every piece works quite the same way. You know, there's these little oddball tracks like The Waiting Room that are just almost hard to listen to, but add to the charm and quirk of the album at hand. That's what I love about concept albums, is even though there's possibly parts that may not work as well as a listener, it still works because it's part of the concept as a whole, so you accept it for its placement in the track list. And it really inspired a lot of the concept albums to come in the more modern prog genre of albums that I love, like Snow from Spock's Beard, Scenes from a Memory by Dream Theater, Brave by Marillion even. All these albums were massively inspired by this one because this was one of the early examples. And there were other concept albums that came before this, so it wasn't really the first example of a concept album, but I think it's one of the early ones that was really prominent in the prog genre, that really had a cohesive storyline and told you this tale from start to end, and just the way it's structured and the way it's told and how one piece goes right into the next. I think it's just a classic setup for the album, and it really shines. In certain moments, it's just perfectly beautiful. Other moments, it's deliciously quirky and strange, and it just culminates in this really interesting package that showcases all that the band's about, and specifically all that Peter Gabriel's about, and his quirkiness and storytelling vibe. And I just love so many moments from it. It's just a great, beautiful record. The explosion in the middle of Fly on a Windshield is one of my favorite prog moments. It just hits you right in the face. I love the beautiful melodies of Cuckoo Cocoon, the explosive prog rock of In the Cage and Back in New York City, the sumptuous sounds of Carpet Crawlers and Chamber of 32 Doors, the burst of fun that begins the start of the second disc of the record with Lily White Lilith, the gorgeous Tony Banks piano in Anyway, the epic playful nature of The Colony of Slippermen. There's so many highlights here that you could point out that are just excellent moments throughout the record that are just so fascinating and fun to get through. And you know, you could quibble with certain things about it. You could say it's a bit overlong. Could they have trimmed some things? Like I said, there's certain tracks that maybe don't grab me in quite the same way. I feel like The Waiting Room is a bit of a waste, but once again, it works in context of the story, so I'm not too mad at it. I think the ending is perhaps a little bit weak. The last track, it's a good track. I don't think it's bad by any stretch, but you'd expect this big sprawling album to have this big epic masterpiece conclusion, and it sort of ends on a less than impressive note with a little bit of just a solid rocker of a song at the end. But overall, I just totally adore this record. It has a lot of character to it. It's iconic. It's one that people point to as one of the classics of the genre. It's one of my parents' favorite records, so I think of it highly in those terms because they really spoke so fondly of it as they shared it with me. So I just really think this is a singular record, and it's unlike anything else in their catalog. It really stands out as a special record that will only happen once. You know, that to me, that's what makes for an iconic record a lot of the times, is it's just this weird experiment that you'll only see once. That's this singular thing that they decided to do for this one album in particular, and after this, they went in a totally different direction. And so it just makes for a very unique experience that can't be replicated by any of their other records. So that's why it always places so high. And I'm a sucker for concept records. And it's fun to find the connective tissue about this story and how it moves from scene to scene in such a great, fascinating way. So that comes to the number 1, which I'm sure you've already deduced by now what it is. This is one of the top albums like on Prior Archives or by anyone who lists out the best prog albums of all time. This is Selling England by the Pound from 1973. Clearly well-deserved number 1. It's number 1 in many people's estimation for a reason. Every track is just totally gorgeous and beautiful and fun and a perfect encapsulation of everything I love about prog. This is like the peak of their progginess before they decided to take a few left turns and try something a bit different with the Lamb, like I mentioned. But this is just classic traditional prog done in an expert fashion, and every track has something beautiful and magical about it. Starts off with Dancing with the Moonlit Night, which begins with those iconic Gabriel a cappella vocals before we get introduction into the music. The band takes you on a journey between gentle acoustic passages to high-octane shuffling rock drums and expressive keyboards and guitars for these proggy instrumental workouts. It really is the perfect prog song that showcases all that the band can do in both the pastoral, lighter setting, but also in these more heavier, more intense proggy workouts. I love it. I Know What I Like in Your Wardrobe is a great poppy song, maybe a little bit of a window into their poppier moments, but it's quirky and different and interesting enough that it doesn't feel like a sellout pop track. It's just an interesting, quirky piece of music that fits well in the vibe of this record. Then you've got Firth of Fifth, which is a total masterpiece. Begins with this iconic, classically inspired piano from Tony Banks with a musical motif that I'll never forget because it's so iconic and so special. It moves forward with this big, majestic, rocking epic with such beauty and these big standout moments with that piano playing a central role. And then in the middle of the track, you get this morph into this great legendary Hackett solo and guitar. So it has these epic, great piano moments, some great epic guitar moments as well, and it all culminates in this wonderful symphonic prog track that's one of the premier prog tracks in the genre. But we're not done yet. You've got More Fool Me, which is a little bit of a break with an acoustic number with Phil Collins on vocals. Battle of Epping Forest provides a fun, jaunty epic that's a fun journey of a track with a relentless energy and an imaginative musical palette. Just a wonderful track that I really love and enjoy. Really hearkening back to that classic era, to Nursery Cryme and those earlier, more imaginative, fantasy-inspired epics. After the Ordeal is a beautiful instrumental featuring piano and acoustic guitar with some flute, which is the perfect bridge between Battle of Epping Forest and Cinema Show, which is another one of their signature premier beautiful pieces of music with some beautiful 12-string guitars, iconic pastoral Genesis opening sound as Gabriel comes to the forefront with his vocals. I love the sparkling nature of all these sounds coming together. You add some flute and some vocalizations on top of this, and it leads to a purely heavenly experience with some upbeat bouncy sections as well, some proggy fast-paced workouts, some shuffling drums and epic proggy keys leading to some soft uplifting mellotron and synth leads as well. Just a beautiful encapsulation of this period of the band, majestic and beautiful but fun and playful at the same time, leading to Isle of Plenty, which is just a little shorter conclusion of a track to just wrap it all up in a nice little bow perhaps. So between the three big tracks to me, Dancing with the Moonlit Night, Firth of Fifth, and Cinema Show, it's just a perfect representation of prog, those three tracks in particular, but then add in the fun of the Battle of Epping Forest and some of these shorter, more poppy and pastoral acoustic tracks, and you've got a fun, great album that has a great pace to it, that has these little tracks as a little bit of a break between these bigger epic tracks. It's just prog perfection in an album. I love this with all my heart. I think this is a perfect album. One of the standouts in prog, could be maybe the best prog album, but there's definitely some contenders there. But it's definitely in that makes of like one of the best premier statements in the field of progressive rock, so it had to be my #1 choice. So there you go. That's my journey of my favorite Genesis records, ranked for my liking. Like I said, this is just my taste and how I feel about the band. I'm sure your list will be totally different, so please share it in the comments. I'd love to get everyone's perspectives and opinions. Of course, keep it civil, keep it nice. That's how we do it on this channel. I like everyone to be really kind to each other. Sometimes when I do these ranking shows, people will come at me with like, you're stupid because you ranked this lower than this. How could you do that? It's all opinion. You know, we're all entitled to our opinions about music and how we feel, and this is all just really down to how the music makes me feel, and that's a very subjective experience that no one else can dictate for me. This is how this music grabs me, and this is what's meaningful to me as a listener. So let me know what that is for you. I don't shame anyone. You know, you could do the complete reverse of my list, and I totally applaud you for your list and what you've got going on. So thank you guys so much for joining me on this little bit of a long-winded episode. I just wanted to give one of my favorite bands their due, so hopefully I honored them with my opinions here. So thank you guys for joining me, and as always, keep enjoying the music. Thank you guys. Bye, everybody.